Welcome to the Church Universal series, where we seek to tell the often untold story of the many apostolates in the Catholic Church which are making a positive difference in the world through their charitable works and prayerful lives. In marriage, are there irreconcilable differences? And if there seem to be irreconcilable differences, what should the couple do about it? You will learn the answers to those questions in today's program. My guests, once again via Skype, are Byron and Francine Parola, who are the directors of the Parish and Marriage Resource Center in Australia and are co-authors of the church-approved Smart Loving series. And today our topic is dealing with brokenness in marriage. Welcome again to both of you.
Thanks very much for having us back.
Hello.
Byron and Francine, what is the biggest challenge facing couples today?
So there's so many. Where do we start? I think one of the biggest areas of challenge is we have a misunderstanding of what the focus and purpose of our marriage is. One of the concerns is that we get into an era thinking our marriage is supposed to make us happy. It's not supposed to bring us together or to make us holy, which we've spoken about before. Mm-hmm. I think there's also some misunderstandings that we have about our marriage, which is, for example, that we are going to have differences. Of course we're going to have differences. We're going to have lots of differences, and the more we know each other, the more different we realise we are. And so we think that everything, particularly as we get longer in our marriage, things are supposed to become easier. In an ironic sort of way, as we go deeper in relationship, we find more things of difference. And so the challenge of marriage is, how do you actually walk a journey together, a journey of intimacy, where every day, if you're doing it well, you discover something about the person that you didn't know, and it was probably something that you didn't expect even, and it was different. And you can get into the issue of, we like to say is that we live a life of irreconcilable difference. And isn't that exciting? Because the excitement becomes, what do you do with it? What do you do as a married couple who've committed their life together, and then you find out you've got a fundamental difference on something that you didn't know about when you were engaged, because it wasn't relevant.
People would say, well, my soulmate, we should just be agreeing on everything, but that's not the reality, is it?
Well, it's a fantasy.
Yeah, and I guess on more serious issues where couples are clashing on, really difficult issues. Interestingly, the research shows that, couples don't often resolve irreconcilable differences, they just outgrow them. So in our case, we had some of our worst arguments at 3 a.m. in the morning about how to get a child, a baby to sleep. And we had different strategies and different approaches to it, and we never, ever resolved that. After 5 children, we were still having the same argument at 3 a.m. in the morning.
We had the same argument for 5 children about 3 a.m. and we just grew out of it because we stopped having children, young children. We still got children, but they grew up, and so so now we have different arguments about our children. But the point was that we had fundamentally different views about the best way to parent a child that couldn't sleep, and it went quite deep to our formation. And probably technically we should have gone into deep counselling and resolved that, probably. Yeah. But practically we were just trying to live and survive. So the trick becomes, how do you practically work with a difference between you in a way that's not destructive, which doesn't just pack it away and put it in a drawer and say we will never speak about that again, because that's when you just set up no-go zones around your relationship. So you spend your whole time walking a tightrope. You don't want that, but at the same time, you've got to recognise that we are very different people, and we have different needs and different expectations, and so how do we honour those things and then make it work in our relationship? And that's the trick of marriage. It's hard, but it's exciting.
Right.
And the great thing about it is, the more you do it, the more you realise that nothing can break your marriage. I mean, I don't know when it happened, but there was a certain point in our relationship, and we're as fiery as anybody else, but there was a certain point in our relationship where I think we both knew that nothing could break us now. We'd been through everything. Nothing was going to break. We could cope with it. No matter what comes, we think we can cope with it. Now, that's, there but for the grace of God. Yeah. But so irreconcilable differences or differences in relationship are to be expected.
Yes.
And the challenge is
I know in religious life, of course, I live with a community of other brothers from different states and different backgrounds and all of that. And I can look at that as that's a threat to me because they don't think as I do, but rather I found that it's something that enriches me because I see things from a different perspective than I would have in just my own myopic view.
Yes, yes, very true. And I think part of our philosophy of approaching this is to change our mindset so that we don't see those occasions of tension and friction as disasters, but to welcome them as invitations to growth. And anywhere, all of the research and the psychology that tells us that the growth in our personal growth happens at the edge of that comfort zone, that we've got to push out of the safe space where we feel really competent and capable and we've got it nailed, and push into territory that is new or that is challenging in order for us to grow. And that's certainly true with the virtues. We don't grow in patience unless our patience is tested.
Yes.
We won't grow in courage unless our courage is put to the test. And so, you know, if we start to view those challenges and those times of friction in our marriage not as, you know, just this is terrible, I've chosen the wrong person, or all of those sort of thoughts that come into our mind, but instead embrace them as this is an invitation for me to become a better, more holy, more virtuous person. It completely changes the approach and our experience of it, because they're positive growth experiences rather than kind of destructive experiences.
Let's talk about some modern challenges. I grew up on a farm, so my parents, there was a great security in their marriage. They were always together, meals together, work together, not a lot of outside influences except for friends and so on. But today you've got social media, you have your own Facebook account, you have these sorts of things that must be threats often to marriage today and a problem.
Yeah, very, very much so. Social media has some great gifts for society, but one of the dangers of it is I think this phenomenon they call the FOMO phenomenon, the fear of missing out. And social media seems to feed on that, particularly as the reality is that we put out to the public on social media the highlights of our family life, of our personal life, and that can create the impression as somebody who's visiting social media that everybody else has these amazing marriages and these, you know, superstar families and, you know, kids overachieving on everything, and therefore, you know, I'm so inadequate in that space. So I think we need.
No one posts on social media their dirty laundry or their unmade bed.
Yeah.
Right.
And if they do, everybody unlikes them. They end up with a very small following.
So there's a, you know, we can probably talk about social media forever, but the main issue that I think it represents is it's a distraction from each other. Yeah. Social media, just like our personal friendship groups, the question, are they drawing us together and supporting us in our relationship, or are they distracting us from it and taking it away from it? Are they setting up a critique of our relationship, or are they setting up an affirmation of our relationship? So, you know, for a marriage to work, it actually needs a lot of things to lean into it. We need to lean into each other, but we need the culture to lean into us as well, to set an expectation that, you know, your marriage is important, that, you know, be good to each other. If everything around us is pulling us apart or leaning us out, then it's a problem. And so we have to be quite discerning about, you know, we say this to young couples: choose your friends carefully. Choose friends who will be supportive of your relationship. Don't, you know, it will challenge you in it. You know, don't, you know, choose a work community that will support your family life. You know, think very intentionally, because it's you know, there's enough complexity in this relationship without everybody else working against us.
Right. Now, in a perfect marriage, would there be no arguments ever?
No, and actually the opposite. And this is what I think every married couple in their pre-marriage, pre-Cana courses should learn, is that actually the research shows that the quality of a marriage is actually proportional to the level of disagreement between the couple. In other words, if you don't disagree, you don't have a strong marriage. Marriages where there's a lack of disagreement, which often is expressed as an argument. So couples who don't argue, their marriages are likely to be more vulnerable rather than strong. And the reason is because we're avoiding things. Right.
Often case.
Yeah. So we will disagree on many things, and this is a useful little framework. We will have lots of disagreements because we're very different people. if we express those disagreements badly, and we often do, we end up in an argument. An argument is the communication outcome of a disagreement. You don't always have to have an argument if you disagree. But if you are arguing, don't panic. It's just the fact that you're not communicating as effectively as you could about a disagreement, which is expected. You know, where to send your kids to school, what time the kids should go to bed, where should we go for the weekend? You know, why didn't you pick your clothes up in the morning like I asked? I mean, we have a zillion disagreements every day, right? How we do that depends on whether we have a conversation or an argument, and you prefer to do the former, not the latter, but we do the latter.
Sometimes.
Married couples should not be panicked. Married couples should not be panicked when they argue. It's not a sign of a failing marriage. It's a sign of a marriage working.
I would add to that, though, that if a marriage doesn't have any arguments, there can sometimes be very positive factors involved in that. So, for example, we know some couples who are mature in years, they've so thoroughly explored their differences that they've reached a level of maturity that they argue very, very seldomly. And when they do, it would be barely recognisable. I think the point that Byron's trying to make is that the absence of arguments isn't necessarily an indication that everything is okay, because there can be lots of other reasons why a couple might not appear to be arguing, including having an argument style that is what they call avoidant, which just means it's like a Cold War. So they don't shout or get aggressive, but they're avoiding each other, and you know, they might not talk to each other for a week. Well, that's a very serious argument, but it might not be recognised as one. It's because it's in that avoidant style.
In the beginning of marriage, when a couple has a disagreement, I suppose the tendency would be to catastrophize that, right? To make it a catastrophe that we're not real, I chose the wrong partner or so on, that could be a temptation.
Yeah. We had a young couple, they were very seriously dating and discerning marriage, and they came to see us because they had had an argument, and they thought that because they'd had an argument that God didn't intend them for each other. And as we talked with them more about it and helped them to appreciate that, well, you know, these arguments aren't necessarily a death sentence for a relationship, that they're, you know, a lot of couples think that, you know, they get what our colleague Bill Doherty says, you know, they get the equivalent of the common cold and they think they've got cancer. And, you know, an argument is not necessarily a death sentence at all. It can just be the symptom of a growing pains, you know, learning how to live with each other, how to adapt to each other's differences.
Couples catastrophize when they lose hope. And it's not uncommon for this to happen. The marriage just gets into a rut, and the arguments are the obvious, you know, because they are points of tension. It's like grinding the gears in a car. You hear it and you feel it. That's the argument. That's the difference, grinding on each other. We're trying to mesh the gears, but we don't notice a neat meshing of the gears.
Right.
We just notice the grinding. And so we can lose hope in the relationship, and that's when we catastrophize. And so we find when we're talking to couples, and we get couples coming to us who are in quite distressed situations, and they leave our home, and we look at each other and we sort of say, my God, we've got more problems than they have. But they've actually lost hope.
Right.
That there's a way forward. And I think that's the real trick here, is that you've got to keep, you know, if you lose hope in any situation, then you become hopeless and you become helpless.
Right.
And that's where the catastrophizing is often a sign of somebody who's actually lost hope.
So there are resources to help people through those difficulties in marriage, and that's part of what you're providing, is saying there's resources here. You have the grace of God. You can work through these things.
Yes.
Well, let's talk about commitment. Do you think people have more difficulty making a commitment today with so-called serial monogamy, where you just have, you know, one after another sort of relationships?
Yeah. Definitely the serial monogamy has become the norm, and particularly if they're cohabitating, they might have one or two cohabitating partners and before marriage, and then one or two marriage partners. So it's actually quite a long series of, and that certainly, I think, trains them into a mentality of thinking that, well, when things get a bit difficult, we just start again with another person, rather than learning how to start again with each other. And we like to, one of our most popular talks and presentations that we do is called Our Many Marriages, where we talk about having lots of marriages, but with the same person.
I've had many marriages to the same woman. But I mean, think about it for a moment. I married Francine. She was a 21-year-old honours student. And now she's a 53-year-old mother of 5, professional, 2 degrees, and a grandmother. Right? She's the same person, but she's a completely different woman to the one I married. And I know her at a level that I never could possibly have known her when we were engaged and dating and getting married. And so I've had many marriages. We've had the pre-children marriage, we've had the early childhood marriage with, no sleep, and we've now got the late teenage empty nesting marriage happening. We're having very different marriages. And the transition points in those marriages require us to learn to re-relate to each other in a new environment. We discover new things about ourselves. What's it mean to be a grandparent? Well, we weren't trained in that.
Right.
But we have subconscious formation beliefs about that.
Yeah.
And so, we learn to do that together. So we have, in those moments of transition, you often find arguments and disagreements occurring. And so quite often what we say is that when you find the marriage feels like it's hard work, it's not failing, it's just transitioning to a new stage quite often.
And that's really where, to bring it back to your question about commitment, that's really where the commitment holds us through those difficult times, so that we can persist through them. I grew up water skiing. It was one of our sort of family traditions, was to water ski, and that's always the image that comes back to me. It was just beautiful skiing on the lake when you'd get up at dawn and it'd be nice and flat and glassy, almost like a mirror, and you'd slalom back and forwards, and then a boat would come past and you'd hit the wake, and you'd just have to hold on through those rocky periods, and then you'd get to the glassy bit again, and it would be sort of sliding backwards and forwards. And I think it's not a bad analogy for marriage, is that commitment holds us. It helps us to hold on to that rope through those rocky times, so that we can get to transition into another stage. And I think marriage is a bit seasonal like that. There's difficult times. And
if you don't, as they say, unpack your bags, or if you don't burn your boats on the shore, then you've always got this subconscious exit in mind.
Right.
And we came to marriage with an expectation that it was for life. And there are times when we've been so angry with each other, one of us has literally stormed out the front door.
Yeah.
Just go for a walk, because we just couldn't speak to each other. But we always knew there was never a question we would leave. Yeah. So we had to work it out, because if we didn't, it was going to be miserable, right? We had to come back. And so if you don't have that, though, then it just gets a bit hard, you lose a bit of hope, and you pull the chute.
And that really leads to growth, doesn't it? That really leads to, because we can just run from our own immaturity, our own selfishness, and we're just going to repeat it over and over and over again. But when in this situation, you're having to face yourself. And I remember Father Andrew Apostoli talking about consecrated life. He said the vow is like a fixed peg. You've made a choice for something that's good, that you've chosen as good. Well, life has its way of making you waver, right? But the vow keeps you fixed on that point that's going to lead to fulfillment and growth.
Yes. We attended a talk with Jordan Peterson recently, and he talked a little bit about contention in marriage. And he talked about how in his relationship that the commitment was the bedrock, and it allowed his wife, to challenge him and tell him the truth about himself. And she knew she could do that confidently because he wouldn't walk away, because of the strength of their commitment. And I think that's an important kind of insight, to appreciate that when we've got that confidence in the commitment that we've made, we can go to the places where the growth is going to be the hardest, because we know that we're not going to walk out on each other, or we're not going to back down. And so I think commitment really gives marriages the advantage, because we can explore those taboo topics. We can go to those difficult spaces, knowing that the marriage will survive it, even if it's very difficult.
What about if a spouse is very uncooperative? Is there no hope because the other one's not willing to work through this? How do you counsel people who have a spouse who's just kind of belligerent, perhaps, or unwilling to change?
I think the first thing to remember is we say it takes one to tango, to just paraphrase and break that kind of idea that unless your spouse is fully cooperating with you, there's nothing you can do to help a marriage. And a really good thought experiment to do with somebody who's in a difficult situation is to ask them, if they don't believe they can make a difference, is to say, well, is there something you could do to make the marriage worse, to make the situation deteriorate? And they can always think of what they could do to make it worse. Well, if they can single-handedly make it worse, they can single-handedly make it better as well. And so the task for them is to focus on becoming the best person they can be, to work on their own virtue, their own prayer life and spiritual support and so on, so that they can bring the best of themselves to the relationship. Because at the end of the day, they can't change the other person, they can't force them to change, but they can change themselves. And if they change the way that they interrelate with the marriage, well, then that changes the dynamism of the marriage and opens up the capacity for the other person to be invited into that.
Yeah, it takes, marriage is a dance, literally. It's a dance, and it only takes one person to change their step, and the dance has to change. Doesn't necessarily make it perfect, doesn't necessarily make you a great dancer. But if one of us changes, the relationship will change, right? And if one of us changes for the better, and this is all we're called to do. I mean, my vows called me to love her as best as humanly possible, come what may. It didn't say she had to love me.
Right.
We made a mutual commitment. So my vow stands. Now, it doesn't mean it will be necessarily always easy, but most of the time, people are melted by somebody who loves them. No matter how resistant they are, if you are working in their interest, if you are barracking for them, are you being generous towards them? And I don't mean being a doormat, and being walked all over, but if your orientation is I'm trying to love you as best I can and I care for you, no one can resist that completely. They will change. Now, they mightn't change to be perfect. None of us are perfect. But you can change the marriage by yourself to some degree. And then usually you get a positive dynamic out of that. And that's always the hope.
What about forgiveness? Is that really an essential component then, I suppose, to a happy relationship?
It's a daily exercise.
Daily exercise.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things about forgiveness that helps couples to work out how to do this practically in their relationship is firstly to appreciate, particularly when there's been a very serious betrayal or a breach, is that forgiveness is not the same as reconciliation. You can have forgiveness without reconciliation. You can't really have reconciliation without forgiveness. So forgiveness is a precursor, if you like, to reconciliation.
Okay.
But forgiveness itself can happen in its own environment. It doesn't mean that you have to trust the person again or necessarily be reconciled with them. And so that's an important thing for couples to understand, or individual spouses, so that they can approach forgiveness then from the perspective of, well, God commands us to forgive.
Yes.
God only ever wants our good, so we need to take that very seriously. And that we can forgive without actually interacting with the other person necessarily.
So if Francine hurts me, I can forgive her. I don't necessarily condone the action. I might have even spoken to her about it, right? But I can still forgive her for the action, for the hurt that was caused. And if you think about it carefully, if I don't, then what am I doing? I'm harbouring a resentment. And the only thing that hurts, the only person who gets hurt by harbouring resentment is yourself. Right. Somebody once said to be resentful or to withhold forgiveness is like drinking a poison and expecting the other person to die.
Right.
We can't be fully present, we can't be fully alive when we're harbouring resentments. We're in a defended state all the time. And so,
but actually that then does impact
the other person,
all the other people in our lives. So if we've got a resentment or a lack of forgiveness in any area of our life, it might be from a childhood wound, that is going to be limiting our capacity or limiting my capacity to give myself totally to Byron. And so part of the task of forming a healthy marriage is actually almost taking a regular kind of inventory to look at what resentments am I still carrying, because it's causing me to hold back. And that's one of the reasons why we focus so much on family of origin issues, is to, I guess, in some ways help resolve some of those things.
As we're coming to the end of our program here, tell us about the Smart Loving Breakthrough course and how people can learn more.
So the Breakthrough course came really as a response to the couples that would, or single spouses that would ring me wanting to come on one of our marriage seminars, which is for couples, and their spouse was uncooperative. And they really had often very significant difficulties. So we wanted to create something that an individual spouse could do on their own without requiring their husband or wife to attend it with them.
So it's a 3 to 4 hour short course, video-based, where effectively it takes couples through a reflection and exercise around about forgiveness. So precisely what we were talking about, to bring them to a point where they feel like they can actually positively work on forgiveness.
And
again, because you can change the dance.
And how can they learn more? What is your website?
So if they go to smartloving.org and they look under online courses, they'll find us there. Yeah.
Well, it's a great source of resources for couples to grow in their married love, to work through the difficulties. So I thank you very much for all the work that you're doing, and God bless you.
Thank you, Father Joseph.
Are you going through a difficult time in your marriage, or do you know someone who is? Remember that you are not alone. The Lord will help you. And there are resources that can help you and your spouse to find your way to renewed love and joy. Perhaps the Smart Loving Breakthrough Program will be part of God's providence in bringing healing to you and to your marriage. We will see you again this time next week for another episode of the Church Universal.